Well, now we're to the 1960s, and boy, a lot of stuff happened in the 1960s, particularly for Native American issues. Things got off to a bang early in the decade in the summer of 1961. In July, or actually June 14th to the 20th, a one-week conference held at the University of Chicago that was coordinated by Darcy McNichol, a Salish or Flathead tribal member who we've mentioned before in passing. He was one of the American Indians who worked on the staff of John Collier during the Roosevelt administration. He was an anthropologist and also a novelist. Anyway, he pulled this all together, and there were 450 delegates representing more than 60 tribes came together for a week, and by the time all was said and done, they had come up with a document, the Declaration of Indian Purpose, which outlined several goals that they had decided that American Indians throughout the country should coordinate together to work on achieving, not the least of which was the end of termination, also the protection of treaty rights, the establishment of self-determination, and building self-sufficient economies on the reservations. Quote from the conference, what we ask of America is not charity, not paternalism, only that the nature of our situation be recognized and made the basis of policy and action. Also, they called for the right, quote, to choose our own way of life and, quote, preserve our precious cultural heritage. That declaration was presented to President Kennedy. The various items in the Declaration of Indian Purpose would provide sort of a template for Native American activists throughout the 1960s and 70s in what they were trying to accomplish. Now, they're at the conference, and by the way, I said there were 450 delegates, but some accounts have the attendance as high as 800 and as many as 90 tribes represented. But there at the conference, there were some young people who were there who took issue with the approaches of the older, more conservative activists, people like Vine Deloria and Darcy McNichol, whom they believed didn't go far enough, and they wanted to introduce a bit more direct action. And so several of them got together, a core group of about 10 or 15, and established an organization called the National Indian Youth Council right after the conference, which is still around. It is the second oldest Native American organization after the National Congress of American Indians. The founders of this group included a Ponca tribal member named Clyde Warrior, and I've got two pictures of him here because he had, a few years before this, been a championship fancy dancer in powwow dancing. Also Mel Thom, who was Paiute, and Viola Hatch, who was Arapaho. And I'm not 100% sure this is her in the photograph. I had trouble finding photos of her when she was young. There's a lot of photos of her when she was older. But she would become very active in the American Indian movement after this. And she went on to become the tribal chair of the Cheyenne and Arapaho in Oklahoma. The NIYC would go on to be an inspiration to some of the other more radical groups that came along later in the 1960s. And some individuals, like Viola Hatch, for instance, who were involved in the one, would go on to also be involved in others. And sort of the divide between the younger activists and the older, more conservative activists kind of mirrored what was going on later in the decade with the black freedom struggle, with the rise of black power, when a lot of young activists accused the older ones of being a little too much accommodating, a little too easygoing, maybe, and sometimes would refer to the older ones. I'm sure you're familiar with this as Uncle Toms, implying they were accommodationists. The term Uncle Tomahawks was used for some of these older Native American activists by the younger ones. Sometimes also they were called apples, meaning they're red on the outside and white on the inside. Now, the NIYC would get involved in direct action type things. They would help coordinate the fish-ins up in the Pacific Northwest, particularly in the state of Washington, which is something we'd be talking a lot about in most of my classes, but since this is the Plains tribes, not a lot of fish-ins there. But in the early to mid-60s, that was very important in Native American activism. One other note about that conference in Chicago, I said there were 450 delegates, but the actual attendance was much higher, by some accounts as many as 800 people representing more than 90 different tribes. In some ways, you could say that this early on in the 1960s, that the NIYC was sort of like the antecedent of the Red Power movement, if not, in fact, sort of the nascent stage of the Red Power movement, kind of the way that Malcolm X was an immediate antecedent of the Black Power movement. The movement got accelerated in the presidency of Lyndon Johnson after Kennedy's assassination. Johnson, who had his War on Poverty initiatives, that was a big part of his domestic policy. He wanted to see those initiatives administered on the reservation by a broad base of people, a broad base of participants, not only the tribal leaders. So that gave the younger activists an opportunity to get more involved. And he was sort of sweeping around, in some cases, the older and more conservative leaders that they had been criticizing in doing that. Now let's talk a bit about Vine Deloria Jr., who is best known for his 1969 classic work, Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto, which gave American readers a very darkly sarcastic Native American view of life in America and of anthropologists in particular. Deloria was the nephew of Ella Deloria, the anthropologist and novelist. He was a member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. He was born actually near Pine Ridge, and in 1964 he became the director, the executive director of the National Congress of American Indians. At the age of 32, he had at that time a master's degree in theology. He would later get a law degree. So for 3 years, he was the executive director of the NCAl. And as he expressed it, their goal was, quote, for the first time that tribes can plan and run their own programs for their own people, without someone in the BIA dictating to them, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In 1966, Deloria and 60 other Native activists showed up at Congress, where the Secretary of the Interior was going to meet in a closed session with Congress about about Indian affairs. There was quite a scene and quite a bit of bad press from the fact that here's this room of politicians deciding the future of Indian affairs, and they didn't allow any Indians in the room. The secretary promised that he would have no more closed-door meetings where Indian affairs were concerned, and he would never discuss any new policies without consulting with tribal leaders. And since around that time, since 1966, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs has always been Native American. For, well, most of the history of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, that was not the case, the only exception being Eli Parker under U.S. Grant 100 years earlier. By the way, it's no longer called Commissioner of Indian Affairs since about 1977. Now it is called Assistant to the Secretary of the Interior on Indian Affairs. Well, Deloria, after his term as director of the National Congress of American Indians, that's when he wrote Custer Died for Your Sins, which was a huge hit. And he wrote about 20 more books after that. Like I said, he got his law degree. He became a professor of political science at the University of Arizona, where in 1978 he started the very first ever master's program in American Indian Studies. Later, he also taught at the law school there, and he taught at Colorado for a while. During the 60s, the NCAl and other activist groups increasingly called for self-determination, that is, the ability to make their own decisions about what happens on their reservation, what happens with their resources, rather than being dictated to by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You'll remember, for example, that under the Indian New Deal, they were able to have tribal governments again, but the chief was appointed by the federal government, usually the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Also, the concept of reserved sovereignty was talked about a lot. Reserved sovereignty, which basically is saying that the Native American nations at one time were sovereign, and they had given up their sovereignty to a limited degree by signing treaties in which they gave away certain rights. However, reserved sovereignty means any rights they did not specifically, explicitly say they were giving up in any of those treaties were still retained by the tribes. As you're probably aware, in 1965, under the Johnson administration, the Voting Rights Act was passed by Congress and signed by LBJ into law. You know that pertains to voting rights for African Americans, but what does it specifically mean? Well, it meant that these states in this map here that were affected had certain restrictions placed on them, inasmuch as they could not change voting laws, make any adjustments to voting laws without the approval of the federal government. And these were all places that had a history, a tradition of using local and state voting laws to basically, through chicanery and various legal maneuvers, prevent African Americans from being able to vote. So the darkest color there, that's where the whole state was affected. The medium color, certain counties that had a history of doing this, and the lightest of the three shades, just certain townships. You will notice that in addition to the Deep South and then some areas in New York, for example, and California, um, Alaska, Alaska and South Dakota. Now, remember earlier when we were talking about the fact that the American Indians were made citizens, therefore having all the rights of citizens, including voting back in 1924. But one of the things that spurred the creation of the NCAI was that in the 1940s, by the 1940s, certain states were pulling various tricks to prevent Native Americans from being able to vote. So this pertained to those areas. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 did not only apply to African Americans, it also applied to areas that had a history of interfering with the voting rights of Native Americans. Now, you may or may not be aware, a few years ago, a lot of the stuff that was in that act that empowered the federal government to supervise changes in election law in these states was undone by the Supreme Court. Their reasoning being, we don't need stuff like that anymore. It's the 21st century, and there's not any racism. Well, I'll let you judge how that's working out. Anyway, the Voting Rights Act also applied to American Indians. Near the end of his presidency, Johnson also signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1968, sometimes called the Indian Civil Rights Act. The first part of this law pertained to American Indians. The second part pertained to giving the government the authority to prevent housing discrimination based on race or disability. But the Indian part essentially laid out that tribal governments still being in the United States still were held to the Bill of Rights. That is, an American Indian living on a reservation and living under a tribal government still had all the rights enumerated in the first 10 amendments. And the only exception was the establishment of a religion. Now, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution says the United States cannot establish a religion. But, let's say, for example, the Cherokee Nation, they can have as their official religion the Cherokee religion. But that's the only difference. What that means, too, by the way, is that things like freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, all those things. This means that tribal governments could not crack down on critics of the tribal government who happen to own newspapers or have a public forum. The late 1960s, early 1970s was kind of like an American Indian artistic and literary renaissance, sort of like the Harlem Renaissance for African Americans in the 1920s and 30s. We talked about Custer Died for Your Sins, which came out in 1969. Also in 1969, this novel, House Made of Dawn, by the Kiowa author N. Scott Momaday, won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, the first American Indian to win the Pulitzer Prize. And then here he is in the center picture many decades later in 2007 being awarded the National Medal of the Arts by George W. Bush. It's a really, really good book. I mean, you can kind of guess that from the fact that it won a Pulitzer Prize, but I highly recommend it.